Hello buddy, yeah, it's Wyron here, back with another round of historical content. And this time around we will once again be discussing some history versus Warhammer, with the focus being on a very special vehicle, the steam tank. That said, this time around it is less a discussion of inspiration and more an interesting case study because, well, the Warhammer steam tank has no real-life counterpart. It's a steampunk tank, and that's all there is to it. However, I find it interesting that it has no real-life counterpart, because the era during which steam was really the dominant and most prominent method of propulsion during the 19th century, this era really lasted a rather long time, and during this period we saw massive evolution in vehicles such as the train as well as ships. We saw steam vessels, we saw ironclads, vessels such as that. Obviously we saw armored trains, and ultimately we saw our armored trains being created during the 19th century, and yet during this entire time period no tanks were made. And I found this very surprising because throughout history we see humanity for really millennia trying to find different force multipliers, different ways in which they can kill each other more efficiently, and without sort of exposing oneself to danger. And we see this worldwide. We see the Chinese Dongwu Che, many of these weapons we've discussed in the prior video. Weapons such as the Dongwu Che in China. We have, of course, Assyrian siege vehicles. Of course, there is war chariots, which were a massively influential weapon during the periods of antiquity. We also have the Hussite war wagons, which were discussed very prominently in the last video. Siege weaponry, of course. And even weapons, and even, well, beasts of war, such as the elephant, war elephants that were utilized in the Mediterranean as well as the Indian subcontinent. These were really meant to be force multipliers and provide that sort of shock unit punch to be able to break through enemy lines and cause just run rampant, cause terror and instill terror in the enemy and that sort of thing. And yet this, and hell, we even had the Da Vinci tank, or as it's now often called, which obviously was not self-propelled, but was once again a vehicle designed to be a force multiplier. And yet, when the 18th and 19th centuries roll around, when steam power develops and becomes an ever more potent method of propulsion, we do not see any major army utilizing it to create an armored fighting vehicle. And I found this fascinating. I find this a very interesting sort of topic to touch on. And so that's what we're really going to be discussing. We're going to be diving in. We're going to be talking about the history of steam road vehicles, in especially the 18th and 19th centuries. We are going to be talking about some of the parallel steam developments, such as trains and ironclads during this time period. We're going to be talking about some weapons developments that could have encouraged perhaps armor deployment, and then finally sort of wrapping things up and discussing why it did not come to be. Why weren't there any steam tanks? Finally, as a nice little touch to wrap things up, we will sort of look at the technology we've seen displayed, and we're going to compare it a little bit to the Warhammer steam tank and see how it squares up against historical steam vehicle limitations. So I do hope you guys enjoyed the video. As usual, be sure to leave your thoughts, comments, critiques, or other insights down below. I'd love to hear what you guys have to say, and without further ado, let's dive right in. So first and foremost, before we do examine what armored vehicles or steam-powered armored vehicles there were, or what development of them there was, I think it is important to explore, if only briefly, the history and evolution of steam road vehicles in the 18th and 19th centuries. And this is really so we can ascertain the level of technology we are dealing with. It would be very simple for me to say, oh, why didn't they make a steam tank? But if the technology just wasn't there, if the sort of resources and the power of the steam engine just wasn't adequate to create a steam tank, then obviously the answer is rather simple at that point. So we're going to be exploring that, and we're going to start at the very beginning, as early as 1770, wherein the French engineer Nicolas Joseph Cugnot designed his steam-powered fardier, or cart, and this was the first ever steam-powered road vehicle. There are some claimed examples from decades and even centuries prior. However, these all remain unconfirmed, unverified. And so we're not going to be including those here. We're not really going to focus on them. Cugnot's design, though, was relatively well documented and described. So we do know what we were dealing with here. And it was designed with the express intention of towing artillery. It was meant to be an artillery tractor for the French military. And in this capacity, it was meant to tow artillery pieces at the rate of 4 miles an hour. And honestly, it failed. Max speed achieved was 2.5 miles an hour. This was with only 4 passengers riding aboard it, and it needed its fires relit every 15 minutes. One of the significant issues with early steam road vehicles was the fact that due to the unevenness and instability of roads, the sort of jumping around and rocking around of the steam engine would result in the fire base being extinguished, and the fire needed to be relit every 15 minutes, which is pretty insane. That is definitely not a sustainable sort of engine for any sort of road movement. However, it is interesting because it is an early case of the steam road vehicle, and we also see that right from the beginning, steam road vehicles were being considered by militaries, the top of the line militaries at the time, for their potential utility. Now, certainly the Cugnot example here was a failure, but regardless, I think it does set the stage for future designs and future development. Now, for the next 30 years or so, steam power doesn't make massive strides, and it was really when Englishman Richard Trevithick developed high-pressure steam that suddenly steam-powered vehicles really became viable. And this didn't simply apply to road vehicles. This applied, of course, to locomotives. This applied to steamships, that sort of thing. High-pressure steam allowed steam engines to be truly viable. It allowed them to pull their own weight and that of a heavy attached load, so an actual vehicle. Like we discussed before, the most Cugnot could get out of his Fardier was 2.5 miles an hour, which is pretty abysmal. Trevithick, with his 1801 design, the Puffing Devil, managed to attain a speed of 9 miles an hour with a machine that weighed 1.5 tons. Now, certainly 9 miles an hour is nothing crazy impressive. However, it is a significant jump from Cugnot's design in 1770. Now, granted, the Puffing Devil, also a bit of a disastrous failure. It blew up and broke down on when it was unsupervised on its initial run. And yeah, so it didn't perform too great. But within 2 years, Trevithick had designed what was then known as the London Steamer, a vehicle that managed to travel 10 miles with multiple passengers aboard without breaking down. And much of this might sound ridiculous as these minuscule steps forward, but it's a significant leap from having to have your fire relit every 15 minutes and having constant breakdowns and your engine exploding to being able to travel a whole 10 miles without issue. That is a significant leap. It's also worth noting that the issue of fires being extinguished was in part resolved by the usage of larger wheels. The larger wheels on steam road vehicles enabled them to have greater stability on potentially uneven roads, meant that the engine was not knocked about as much, and as a result, the fires were not as easily extinguished. So this was a bit of an early fix to that issue we discussed with Cugnot's machine as well. And Mr. Trevithick, by 1804, he had developed he had moved to locomotives. He designed the first full-scale steam locomotive, and sort of the torch from then on was passed on to other developers, really, when it came to road vehicles. But all of those would be utilizing the high-pressure steam that he had developed. Also, road vehicles became more and more accepted. As no longer were they simply a curiosity. They were now also a means of transport, especially within cities or for shorter distances. Steam road vehicles slowly but surely were just gaining prominence. In the 1830s, we saw the company Summers and Ogle creating some of these early three-wheeled steam tractors or steam road vehicles for commercial purposes, and supposedly these were able to travel 600 miles without significant sort of damage being incurred upon the engine. So once again, a massive leap in endurance. Now, obviously, this wasn't 600 miles in one go, but it was 600 miles traveled. It was essentially the mileage on these machines, and it shows how much they improved in just the space of 25 to 30 years since Trevithick's initial developments. And it might seem like it was a slow process, and it kind of was, but it's a significant jump going from Cugnot's breakdown every 15 minutes, as we discussed before, to Trevithick's self-destructing engine to 10 miles traveled to 600 miles without breakdowns. That is a huge improvement. And it would continue from there on out. These steam vehicles also began to be used for agricultural purposes. The firm Ransomes, Sims and Jeffries Limited began to create agricultural steam engines in 1841. At first, these had to be towed from farm to farm by horses, but in 1842 they developed a machine that could move itself from farm to farm. And while it might seem a little irrelevant to talk about agricultural machinery, it is in fact somewhat significant, because the usage of steam engines for agricultural work would ultimately inspire, in the 1850s, it would inspire British inventor James Boydell to design the footed or dreadnought wheel. And this was an early predecessor of tracks. It enabled the usage of off-road agricultural engines on farms in a much more reliable capacity. These footed wheels essentially replicated, or were very similar to what now we have tracked vehicles. Before, it was essentially just wooden blocks attached to a wheel so that you could better distribute the weight of the machine, especially on mud or soft surfaces. And this was a significant improvement in allowing what were previously machines essentially just bound to the existing mail or road networks that had been designed. It allowed them to now go off-road. And sometimes the Boydell engine is erroneously claimed to have been used by or tested by the British military in the Crimean War to tow artillery carriages. This is in fact not true. There is some debate. I've seen a lot of articles claiming this was the case. However, historian Richard Ogurkowicz goes to great lengths to debunk this, claiming that if it's confused with simply horse-drawn wagons utilizing the footed wheels. And in fact, Boydell's wheels were only really used on a steam engine in 1855. So the Crimean War lasted 1854 to 1856, and the first Boydell wheeled engine, the Garrett Boydell engine, only appeared in 1855. The first time it was used for pulling a siege gun was at Woolwich Arsenal in 1856. And the Burrell Boydell engine, which is generally believed to be the one used in the Crimea, that's the one people most often associate with it, was not actually completed until 1857. So that was a whole year after the Crimean War. So that is a bit of fake news there, but it does show, one, that steam engines had more versatility, and two, it shows that militaries continued to have interest, and significant interest at times, in the steam engine, because they obviously were looking to make use of the steam engine for they were obviously looking to make use of the steam engine for this artillery towing service. And this would be something that would continue to occur throughout the rest of the 19th century. Militaries such as not just the English military, but also the Prussian military would, and in fact even the French and many of the major powers in Europe would experiment, or at least explore the possibility of using steam engines as artillery towing vehicles, with varying degrees of success and utility. Supposedly the Prussians did use some in the Franco-Prussian War, for example. Now, as for the further development of road vehicles, it was greatly hindered. England had for a long time been sort of the leader of this development, but in the 1860s it was greatly hindered by the locomotive acts that were passed. In 1861, the first locomotive act restricted steam engines to 5 miles an hour in cities, 10 miles an hour on country roads. The even more draconian Locomotive Act of 1865, the Red Flag law, it restricted vehicles to 2 miles an hour in cities and 4 miles an hour on country roads. So massive sort of disincentivizing factor for developing better or more efficient locomotives engines. And it really hurt the development of steam engines in England, at very least. However, this did mean that there was now a shift to other countries. More steam engines would continue to be developed in England for sure, but also now in France and in the USA and other nations. Some significant landmark achievements were achieved. For example, the velocipede, or essentially a steam-powered motorcycle, was developed essentially at parallel times by an Massachusetts native Sylvester Roper in 1869, as well as we also saw the Michaud Perrault velocipede in France in 1869. Further development was also made by H.P. Holt, who in the 1860s actually designed a relatively light and effective steam engine that was able to achieve 20 miles an hour in 1866. So we see that increase in mobility. If we go back in time, we could see those lower speeds, such as 9 miles an hour on the Trevithick's Puffing Devil. And in 1866, H.P. Holt attained 20 miles an hour, so over double that speed. And previously, we already saw such speeds on, say, trains. Trains were already achieving greater velocities, but it's not quite as easy for road vehicles to achieve such speed, and so it was definitely a significant milestone. In 1869, Robert William Thomson would utilize rubber tires for the first time on his steam engine designs, and this was once again another significant step forward. Ultimately, well, rubber tires are this standard of modern day road vehicles. So while not necessarily the most significant thing from a military potential perspective, it does still show some of the development. I definitely think it's a major highlight. And finally, this is perhaps one of the most impressive things that definitely surprised me. In 1881, Frenchman Amédée Boilly, and I really apologize if I butcher these names. I'm trying not to, but I don't speak French, so I apologize. But in 1881, he developed the Rapide. The Rapide, a steam vehicle that was actually able to attain 38 miles an hour on the roads, which is insane. That was a huge jump, and it really shows just how much steam road vehicles, or just how far steam road vehicles had come. But the fact that by the late 1800s, not even the late 1800s, we're talking like mid the 1860s through to the 1880s here, vehicles were attaining speeds in the 20s and 30s and almost 40 miles an hour, and that is some massive progress. Now, a lot of these were lighter weight vehicles. They were often stripped down as much as possible to sort of attain these speeds, but still, it does show the improvement in the power output of these engines and their capacity to propel armored vehicles, and their capacity to propel vehicles, and potentially could have propelled armored vehicles. Now, as the 1900s, or as the 19th century did draw to a close, we did see the English once again utilizing steam engine, this time the Fowler road trains, to transport supplies in the Boer War. Now, this in and of itself is nothing spectacular. We've already discussed that it was utilized by the Prussians earlier during the 1870 Franco-Prussian War. We talked about the fact that the British Army experimented with them prior. But the reason it's significant is because the Boer raiding and the Boer commandos harassing the English supply convoys actually encouraged the Brits to order armored road trains. And this became the first serving armored road vehicle. Now, certainly they were nothing crazy impressive. It was essentially an armored box built up over top of a Fowler road train. It wasn't anything spectacular. The armor plates were not necessarily rated as bulletproof. They were bullet resistant, out to decent range, but still it wasn't sort of a spectacular, immune to even smaller fire vehicle. But it did provide some protection for the crew from shrapnel, from rifle fire at longer ranges. It actually proved supposedly successful in a few skirmishes, to the point that the English actually ordered more of them. The vehicle was provided with loopholes for the soldiers inside so that they could shoot back at their attackers, and it was in fact capable of carrying a small artillery piece internally. Now, granted, this was not an artillery piece you could fire out of the vehicle, but it was something that you could transport, a method of transport. And so we see that by the 1900s, steam power did enable vehicles such as the Fowler armored train. It was clearly possible to create armored vehicles by this point. And given the performance we've seen from, say, the H.P. Holt vehicles, as well as Amédée Boilly's designs in the 1880s and 1860s even, we see that the power of steam vehicles was most likely adequate by that time to propel at least a simplistic armored vehicle. It should be noted, and this is not going to be a major point here, because in obviously during the early 20th century, we did see armored vehicles begin to be powered almost exclusively by internal combustion engines. We saw armored vehicles becoming more and more prominent. Various armored cars were very popular during the pre-World War I era, and then of course during World War I there was an explosion in all sorts of tank designs, particularly from the Allied nations, the French and English in particular. However, it should be noted that there were a few steam tanks designed during this time period, and that is actually what we will touch on here. And these were in fact American designs, both hailing from the U.S. One was the steam wheel tank. This was designed by Holt Manufacturing, which is now Caterpillar Incorporated, and this was developed in the 1916s and 17s, and it was. And it was, in fact, evaluated and tested in 1918 at Aberdeen Proving Grounds. Now, it didn't perform particularly well. It was a wheeled design. It was essentially, once again, a wheeled armored box. And, well, it wasn't too crazy. It weighed 17 tons, so definitely fairly hefty in size. The armor rating was 5.8 to 16 millimeters, so it would have been adequate to stop most, if not all, small arms fire. 5.8 millimeters definitely pushing it a little bit, but 16 millimeters definitely would have been more than adequate. Each of the rear wheels had its own engine, a 2-cylinder 75 horsepower Doble steam engine, and well, it was meant to be a tank. It was meant to be essentially a competitor to the likes of the British designs. Now, the other example we did see was the American steam tank. Now, this was actually a full-on track design, and it actually imitated the British tank designs, such as the Mark IV tank and Mark I, and really the whole rhomboidal series of English tanks. And that was what this vehicle was designed to essentially replicate in. Which was really sort of the vehicles this was competing with. And now the vehicle actually used a combined system. It actually had an auxiliary gasoline engine to build up sufficient pressure, but the two main engines in the vehicle were both 2-cylinder steam engines, and these actually generated a grand total of 500 horsepower. Now, the vehicle itself could only achieve speeds of 4 miles an hour, but this was because the vehicle weighed 50 tons. So the horsepower to ton ratio was rather poor. It was certainly nothing spectacular. Once again, it also failed and didn't find much popularity. It was tested in France, though not in a combat role. It was used more for propaganda purposes, and in fact did break down on a public display at one point. But nonetheless, it does show that steam power could be utilized to power steam tanks. And while obviously this is well past the point at which steam power was at its zenith during the 19th century, it does show, I think, the potential it had. And in my opinion, when we look at sort of all that was achieved with steam vehicles and all the potential sort of all the designs that were implemented, I think that it is then interesting that no steam armored vehicle came about. And what we're going to go do now, in fact, is we're going to look at other armored vehicles that were built during the 19th century and see why they came about. Because obviously the technology, I think, is pretty clearly there to build armored fighting vehicles that would use steam. Not necessarily the most mobile vehicles. As we saw, the speeds achieved by the World War I steam tanks were about 4 miles an hour. So they were essentially limited to being breakthrough vehicles. Certainly nothing that could blitz alongside an army. Perhaps lighter steam vehicles could have been designed, but maybe the mobility wasn't necessarily there. But I think the technology was clearly present to design armored steam vehicles. And so what we're going to be doing now is we're actually going to look at other armored vehicles and discuss why they did come about and what sort of encouraged their implementation. So without further ado, let us dive into the world of ironclads and armored trains, because that is where we're going to be going now. Now, obviously, like we just discussed, the technology was there. However, perhaps it was simply the lack of need that made it so that tanks were not built, or steam armored vehicles were not built, or perhaps the perceived lack of need. This is why I think it's worthwhile looking at the case of ironclads in particular, and to a lesser extent armored trains. Ironclads came about because existing navies in the period felt pressured and felt the need to implement them. There was a massive it was just massive pressure to construct them. Technological advancements such as heated shot and shrapnel shells had essentially made wooden ships incredibly susceptible to enemy fire and made them very, very vulnerable to enemy projectiles, especially enemy forts, but even enemy ships. And this was demonstrated in brutal fashion at battles such as the Russo-Turkish engagement at Sinop, where the Turkish fleet just found itself annihilated by the Russians utilizing many of these new shells and the new shrapnel shell projectiles, and it was the results were devastating. During the later Crimean War, the British and the French began their development of armored floating batteries because they found that their ships could not engage the Russian force safely. So they designed these armored floating batteries which could withstand the fire of the Russian forts, fire that would otherwise have crippled or sunk wooden vessels. Now, these floating batteries were nothing fancy. They were not particularly mobile. They basically had to be towed around or assisted a lot of the time. The British ones didn't even see service. It was the French ones who did see some action. However, it showed the way of the future, and it escalated into full-blown ironclads in the years following the Crimean War. The French, feeling that they couldn't match the English naval development, began with the Gloire, the first ironclad warship, which resulted in a British response with vessels such as the Warrior class. Within a few years following that, in the 1860s, during the U.S. Civil War, ironclads proved near invulnerable to smaller caliber artillery, which was found upon wooden warships of the time. Of course, there was the infamous engagement of the Merrimack and the CSS Virginia, or the converted Merrimack, the Confederate ironclad, and the Union ironclad, the Monitor. And it showed just how vulnerable wooden vessels were to ironclads, and also showed that ironclads were not even able to particularly successfully engage one another, which in turn resulted in, well, one, nations realized that they needed to have ironclads because otherwise a single ironclad could essentially run roughshod over their wooden fleets. And at the same time, there was an arms race to develop ways to counter said ironclads. We saw developments of heavier artillery pieces, which is why ships went away from masses of broadsides to just a handful of turreted heavy artillery. Rams were experimented with. It actually looked for a bit as if there would be a resurgence of the ram as a viable method of naval engagement. And early torpedoes and pole mines were also tested against and often utilized against ironclads. So it showed how the need for a solution to a given problem stimulated the growth of an entirely new type of warship, and the resulting success of said warship ultimately just snowballed within a chain series of effects that resulted in the dominance of ironclads within the space of just a few decades of their introduction. Another such need-driven decision was the development of armored trains. Much like the Fowler road trains of the 1900s, armored trains came about during the American Civil War as a response to Confederate raiders harassing Union rail lines and then attacking workers attempting to repair said rails. Because of this, the Union deployed improvised armored trains. At first, they were nothing fancy. They were wooden boxes covered in boilerplate to protect the soldiers within. Each would essentially contain have enough room for a armored embrasure with a 24-pound howitzer and about 50 riflemen. But the concept caught on, and armored trains would continue to see combat use well into the 20th century. In fact, having some significant engagements as late as World War II and continuing service thereafter. So I think it showed, obviously this video is not about armored trains or about ironclads, but it shows how the need for these vehicles drove their creation. So, well, that's how ironclads and armored trains came about. So what about tanks? Was there no need for those? And this is what I find curious, is that during the 19th century, there was a massive evolution of killing power on the battlefield. First and foremost, perhaps, rifling became standard due to the advances in industrialization and interchangeable parts and such developments. We saw, for example, rifling was just standard fare. Previously, rifling had essentially been limited to a few elite skirmishing units. Frontiersmen, hunters, that sort of thing. It wasn't something that entire armies were equipped with. But rifles became standard during the or even the early and especially by the mid and late 19th century. Well, by the mid 19th century, it was just standard. And they extended the lethality and the effective range of small arms and artillery alike. You went from engagements at relatively short distances, we're talking just a couple dozen, at most like 100 meters, to distances that could easily reach out several hundred meters, artillery pieces that could reach out thousands of meters, if not more. And that was a massive spike in killing quality. At the same time, the rates of fire attainable by said firearms also evolved with massive speed. Weapons such as repeater rifles and revolvers, those were already common by the first half of the 19th century. By the latter half, breech-loading rifles and artillery pieces were basically universal. And breech-loading artillery could attain previously sort of unimaginable rates of fire. Same with breech-loaded rifles. Well, I say breech-loaded rifles. Definitely repeater rifles could match that beforehand. But the fact was, rates of fire were going up a lot. And then, of course, was the machine gun. And this was a weapon that was already appearing in the 1860s with the early designs such as the Gatling gun or the French mitrailleuse. And of course, then later the Maxim weaponry, which became sort of the standard template for machine guns around the world. And all of these machines saw their debut during this time period of the 1860s, 70s, and 80s. And it can't really be said that the effect of these weapons could have gone unnoticed. It's not like they just appeared under the table and never saw service. Now, certainly some of them didn't get used to full potential. Some of them were used somewhat poorly. A prime example of that would have been the French mitrailleuse, which was utilized as an artillery piece, and that didn't really work. And so the Germans and Prussians were not really impressed with it. They didn't find it to be a serious threat. However, already the new weapons found other sort of functions. And during the American Civil War, revolver-armed Confederate cavalry repeatedly trounced their saber-armed Union counterparts. At battles such as Gettysburg, we saw the futility of Napoleonic charges, such as Pickett's charge, which is infamous for the picture of Armistead leading the way with his hat on a saber. But at Gettysburg, that massive increase in firepower was already demonstrating the futility of these Napoleonic-era charges when faced with mass modern firepower. At Sedan, French cavalry proved completely unable to break out past the Prussian encirclement. And, throughout Europe's colonial wars, of which there were just many, really too many to list here, but there was a constant flow of numerically disparate victories. Battles such as Omdurman was really a particularly good example in Sudan, where the massively outnumbered English force completely crushed modest insurrectionists in no small part because of the machine guns they had at their disposal. And so this lethality of modern equipment had to have been noticed, yet no tanks arrived. In fact, armored fighting vehicles wouldn't appear until the turn of the century, with vehicles such as the Fowler engine and the aforementioned armored cars. And that really begs the question, why was this the case? Why weren't any tanks designed? And so that's really what we're going to try to piece together here at the finish. See why nothing happened, because the weapons that should have instilled, people often point to World War I, and yes, trench warfare was a significant driving force behind tanks, but many of those conditions that encouraged steam vehicles in World War I had already been met in wars prior. So that's what we're going to be looking at right now. But before we do so, we are actually going to look at one specific design of a paper panzer, or an armored fighting vehicle, which was in fact designed during the mid 19th century. And I think it actually does show that at least some individuals were thinking about sort of the way of the future, and were thinking about where warfare was going. And this was the Cohen's locomotive land battery, or Cohen's land devastator, as it's sometimes called. And I've seen it referred to by different names. It was, however, a essentially early design for a tank, a steam-propelled tank, presented by James Cohen as well as James Sweetlong. They submitted their design for patent, in fact, in April, or on the 3rd of April, in fact, 1855, and it was under the reference number 747. And this was an interesting vehicle. It never saw production. It was never created. All we have of it really are some of the design notes listed by Cohen himself, as well as some rather haggard images of what it was intended to look like. And it was meant to be a, fully protected roving artillery battery. And as we can see here, it was designed with a bit of a sort of turtle shell. The engine was situated on the inside, so unlike, for example, the Warhammer steam tank, which is just ridiculous and has an external engine, Cohen's design had it internally placed engines for, obviously, to protect the vehicle. It was meant to have, it was in fact a wheeled vehicle. Tracks weren't around at the time, with four wheels with four main wheels, and then a fifth guiding wheel present at the front, as we can see on the image, meant to direct the vehicle, and it was intended to hold a whole bunch of cannons. As we can see here, the entire perimeter of the vehicle is just decked in loopholes and artillery pieces. And according to the original description, was supposed to be 14-pounder carronades. It was also meant to have sides, and you can kind of see those at the bottom of the vehicle on the sides. It was intended to have sides on the flanks so as to protect against any troops that tried to come too close. And as we can see, the armor was in fact relatively well sloped and well shaped so as to provide adequate ballistic protection. So definitely some good considerations there being made. Obviously, it's a bit of a silly looking design. It looks like a little bit like just a turtle shell, but still, an impressive amount of thought did go into the vehicle. Now, it was submitted to Lord Palmerston, and in fact, it was rejected. Now, according to Liddell Hart, he claims this was rejected by Palmerston as being too brutal for civilized warfare. Whether this was the case is debatable. I'm not sure if that has ever been verified. However, that was the claim made. And the vehicle, in fact, was meant to sort of and this was a interesting vehicle, to put it mildly. It was clearly designed to be something of a tank. It didn't see any of its any production, and it never saw service, obviously. However, it did in fact go through two design iterations or reiterations by Cohen, both in the initial patent version and the a later machine that he described in 1862 when corresponding with Prime Minister Lord Palmerston. Now, we don't know the exact specifications of the vehicle or what necessarily it was exactly meant to be, or how exactly it was meant to perform, but we do have some idea of what was expected. Obviously, as you can tell from the sketch, it does look a little bit haggard, like an inverted tortoise shell. And this was the sort of original, the original drawing or the original design as described by by Cohen. It was intended to have 4 main. What we do know is that it was intended to have 4 main wheels. With a fifth wheel intended to give it some sort of stability or providing it with guidance. It was also intended initially to have a battery of 14-pounders, carronades, running the perimeter of the vehicle. Now, this was a bit ridiculous and over the top. How exactly Cohen imagined a bunch of 14-pounders would fit into what seems to be a pretty cramped steam engine is a bit beyond me. This 14-pounder artillery is not that small. However, that was the initial claim. The engine, as we can see, was situated in the center of the vehicle, and it was protected by that outer shell, which was relatively well sloped and well designed to provide good ballistic protection for the crew and the artillery pieces within. So certainly a lot of thought had gone into it from that perspective. The vehicle was also meant to have sides running the outer edge, and you can see those curving blades at the base of the vehicle, and these were intended to cut down surrounding infantry and cavalry that was attempting to get a bit too close, perhaps. Now, there are a variety of different artist interpretations, some more true to the original image that we see here than others. Some certainly took a few more artistic liberties. However, Cohen did ultimately submit more information in 1862 to Lord Palmerston. In this correspondence, he did describe the vehicle as being able to travel at 20 miles an hour, and that it could be modified to carry weapons of any caliber or quantity desired. The information he actually provided in this description was that the weapon would be armed with 4-pounder cannons rather than 14-pounders. So that is definitely coming a bit down to terra firma and being a bit more realistic about his expectations. It's also clear that Cohen expected the vehicle to perform as a ram, that with the aid of those peripheral scythes, it would be able to plow through enemy formations, whether infantry, cavalry, or even artillery, and simply overrun them. And as if that wasn't enough, Cohen also imagined that the vehicle could be loaded onto special armored pontoons and be utilized in a naval function if needed. So he definitely envisioned this as the sort of universal weapon of the future. And it definitely is an interesting design. And it is worth noting that it was, in fact, given at least some credence by the authorities at the time. Now, clearly it was not built. Clearly some of the design features listed are a bit debatable. For example, achieving 20 miles an hour, obviously we saw that the Holt steam vehicle was capable of reaching 20 miles an hour around the same time period, around the 1860s. We did see that, trains at the time could reach 20 miles an hour. But whether or not a heavily armored vehicle such as this one would be able to reach 20 miles an hour is another question. Especially given that the design seems to lack any sort of footed wheels or any sort of enhancements to stability, it's dubious that it would be able to achieve much, if any, mobility on poor terrain. So that would certainly have to have been a consideration. However, Lord Palmerston did pass the idea on to the War Office, and they then rejected it. The War Office and the Board of Ordnance at Woolwich, while looking at it, didn't accept it. Now, there were some claims I've seen thrown about by Liddell Hart that Palmerston himself rejected it as being too brutal for civilized warfare, but it's pretty clear this was not a consideration here, given that he did sort of pass the message on for Cohen to the Ordnance Office. But even Cohen himself stated that it wasn't Lord Palmerston who rejected it. He harshly critiqued the British Army and the Commander-in-Chief, Lord Harding in particular, as not understanding engineering and not having a respect for the potential of his vehicle. However, the vehicle, this didn't really change the situation, that the vehicle was rejected and not developed any further. But I do think it is interesting to discuss for the simple fact that, well, it was a it was a lone and early tank design in the midst of the 19th century, and shows that at least some individuals did give it consideration in this time period. Which then does bring us to the point, though: why was the steam tank here rejected, or even the concept of it rejected, and why was it not? Why was the idea never sort of resurrected or pursued further by other armies at the time? Now, personally, obviously, this is all a bit of speculation, and there is obviously a lot of this is just speculation, and all I can do is really wager or guess on what the issues with steam vehicles were for the British Army as well as other European armies. However, I do think we can, based on the critique provided by Cohen, as well as by other factors that we know of from 18th and 19th century warfare, I think we can make some educated guesses as to why steam vehicles didn't really take off. So I think that the reasons for the lack of acceptance for the steam armored fighting vehicles, or even the lack of development of them, could really boil down to a few factors. One, I think, sort of touched upon by Cohen, and this I think was one of the lesser issues, really, was the question of tradition. Obviously, steam technology was a newfangled and sort of not necessarily that well known technology, I guess, or that well accepted technology, at least in the early 19th century, though it was certainly expanding. And there was certainly a degree of mistrust and dislike towards this new technology from many of the more conservative elements of European militaries. In fact, as late as the 20th century, we had individuals such as Kaiser Wilhelm critiquing armored cars, or disliking armored cars for the fact that they scared the horses in the army. And while this is obviously mostly anecdotal, these would often be one-off cases, and I don't think would necessarily be the deciding factor in rejecting a potentially effective weapon of war. I think it was certainly something that influenced thoughts and opinions of the generalship and military leaders at the time. However, what I think was more significant is really the mobility of 19th and 18th century warfare. I think a lot of people don't realize how mobile it was. The warfare at the time was. Armies during the Napoleonic Wars, or during the 7 Years' War, and then even later during American Civil War or Franco-Prussian War, would often be averaging 10 to 20 miles march a day. So some pretty high mobility, and this was something that especially early steam road vehicles couldn't really keep pace with, especially if roads were not in sort of great condition, or the road networks were not necessarily the best. In comparison, obviously trains could generally keep up with armies, and in fact trains became a significant part of warfare in the mid to late 19th centuries. But for actual sort of ground warfare mobility away from rails, steam vehicles just didn't really necessarily have the reliability or the mobility to keep up with an army of that nature. By the time they did get the reliability, sometime in the late 19th century, we actually did see steam vehicles used for logistical purposes, such as the Fowler engine by the English, or some German tractors that were used during the Franco-Prussian War. Once the technology was a little more reliable, it was used in this rear line role, but in a frontline role, being forced to keep pace with frontline troops would have definitely been an issue. And despite Cohen's incredibly optimistic 20 miles an hour for his armored vehicle, if we look at the tanks of World War I, which were built upon far better technology and far better power plants than what would have been available in the 19th century, these tanks rarely broke the 4 or 5 mile an hour mark, and generally didn't have massive range. And this is ignoring the reliability and breakdowns, because obviously with the increased weight coming in from armor and the heavy weaponry and that sort of thing, many of these vehicles just didn't have the sustainable. They just didn't have the sustainable mobility to keep pace with a modern army. So essentially, they would have been reduced to siege warfare, really, or static warfare. And yet, this warfare was not really common in the 18th and 19th centuries. Certainly, it occurred. I think it would be very, very wrong of me to say it was unheard of or near unheard of. It certainly happened on a somewhat regular basis. We saw battles such as the Siege of Paris. The Crimean War involved a lot of relatively static warfare. The U.S. Civil War did have some sieges. For example, sieges such as Vicksburg or battles at Cold Harbor involved some costly frontal assaults and such brutal warfare that was really in many ways reminiscent of later World War I actions. But this static warfare or slow warfare was not present in as much quantity as it would be during World War I and II. And armies generally found ways to break the deadlocks with the technology that they had available. They didn't necessarily need newfangled tanks. Generally, they had the artillery batteries would provide enough support to break enemy positions. They sometimes experimented with things such as mining, good old-fashioned undermine your opponent and place mines under their positions. So tactics and strategies that went back really centuries, if not millennia, remained viable in breaking a lot of these deadlock situations. Otherwise, armies would just outmaneuver each other. And so there wasn't necessarily a pressing need to get armored vehicles. The new technology was certainly there to potentially create these sorts of killing fields and these very tough to crack positions. But these situations didn't necessarily occur that often, and even when they did occur, conventional tactics could and were utilized to break such positions. And also, much of the new technology was misused. I think a prime example of this is the French mitrailleuse, which was utilized as an artillery piece despite being a machine gun. And because of this, it failed. It ended up getting counter battery fired by Prussian artillery. And obviously, as a result, the French would not have been that impressed with the weapon, and the Prussians would not have felt particularly concerned by such a weapon. So, in this stretch of mid to late 19th century warfare, armies just didn't really feel the pressure, I suppose, to have a breakthrough vehicle. Which is really what a tank would have been, because it just wouldn't have had the strategic mobility. Given the technology of the time, I think it's a safe assumption to assume that it wouldn't have been able to keep up with the strategic mobility of armies at the time. I also think that the logistical issues would have also been prominent. As discussed before, to an extent, the steam vehicles were not really utilized in any capacity by militaries at the time. Certainly they were experimented with, but even the towing vehicles, it was more experimental. It was only something that really became more and more prominent towards the very end of the 19th century. So armies didn't really have the logistics built up to have an entirely new vehicle type running around with the main force. It would have required armies to field massive amounts of new spare parts, to have massive amounts of coal to fuel these vehicles, would have required all sorts of adjustments to the logistical system, and an entirely new and significant lineup of resources needed to potentially keep these new vehicles going. And I think that many armies, especially given that they were seeing that they were managing just fine against even the new technology with older, or in some cases just updated tactics, but with the fact that there was no pressing need for breakthrough vehicles, stacked on top of this potential downside to breakthrough vehicles, with the new logistics tax that would have been imposed. And I think it is relatively understandable why steam armored vehicles didn't really make it into the sort of limelight, or never really got dabbled in or designed. By the time machine guns and such weapons really did come into their element and were being properly utilized, especially during the I should say like the 1880s to 90s, armies did begin to feel a bit concerned, and even during wars such as the Boer War, armies were beginning to be concerned with the new potential firepower and the stopping power present from trench warfare. The Boers laid quite the smackdown on the Brits by engaging in a method of trench warfare, and their sort of slit trenches and proved very difficult for the British to dislodge with traditional artillery methods. And this actually resulted in massive overhauls of the British military. But prior to that point, there really, for any European army, there hadn't been such a desperate need to upgrade or update their arsenal. And it was, I think, really the turn of the century where armies began to realize that it was only then that armies began to realize that these new weapons were really potentially going to obsolete some of the older tactics and strategies that had worked before. And so we suddenly did see an outburst of newer armored vehicles gaining at least some interest. Unfortunately, at that point, steam power had already fallen off and was no longer the primary sort of method of propulsion for most militaries. At that point, the internal combustion engine was becoming more and more significant during the early 20th century. So that is my theory on why steam tanks did not come to be. Certainly there could have perhaps been other reasons. Feel free to post your own theories down below. I'd be interested to hear them. Now, as for the steam tank we see in Warhammer, well, it's a bit ridiculous, and I think it's pretty clear that the design is a bit silly. Obviously, the armor, well, there's just so many things. One, the engine is exposed. I'm not entirely sure why this is the case. We can even see it on Cohen's Land Devastator that he had the engine embedded within the vehicle in his design. Quite clearly, having your method of propulsion exposed to enemy damage or enemy fire is a major mistake. It's not something you want because it makes it very easy to disable your vehicle. I also think the fact that the wheels are kind of exposed, at least the rear wheels, is also a mistake. On Cohen's Land Devastator, we can also see that the metal shell or skirt or whatever you want to call it that protects the vehicle is in fact covering the wheels, so they are at least mostly protected from enemy fire. Certainly you could get a shot in under the armor plate, but it's a much smaller chance of that. There's a much smaller chance of that happening. So that's also, I think, an issue there with the steam tank. The armor thickness seems a bit ridiculous. If we really look at most of the tanks of especially World War I, most of the armor thicknesses we're dealing with are 15 to 30 millimeters on a lot of these vehicles. Sometimes even lighter, but 15 was sort of the standard main armor on vehicles such as the Mark I or Mark IV, or the British rhomboidal tanks, and vehicles such as the German A7 would have had up to 30 millimeters, but certainly nothing that was reminiscent of just massive slabs of steel. And it looks like the steam tank has probably like a foot thick plate of armor. Would have made it way too front heavy to get anywhere. I also think that, and plus it's a question of what are you protecting against. Chances are artillery pieces are still going to be a major threat to you, and will potentially be able to punch through your armor. Now, obviously, if you're trying to protect against those, at that point you might want more thickness. But if you're just looking to defend against small arms and melee weaponry and that sort of thing, you don't need that much armor plate. So I'm not sure. I feel like the excess armor of the steam tank, it wouldn't make it immune to someone like Kolek coming in and smacking it with a hammer, and at the same time, it doesn't really help the steam tank in any way against enemy shooting or enemy or most enemy projectile weapons or small axes or whatever your opponent might be using. Finally, I also think that the wheels are way too narrow. This I think is relatively clear. Way too small, way too narrow, and that would obviously result in massive issues if the moment you went off-road. This is obviously something that was rectified by the Boydell Dreadnought wheel, and that is most likely what the Steam Tank would want to have. If you wanted an armored vehicle, you could certainly design one. And I don't actually think the Steam Tank's overall layout, if some of these issues were corrected, would have necessarily be that bad. Obviously, it's more of an assault gun than a tank. The steam gun on top is not really the primary sort of method of destruction there. It's obviously the main gun. But which I should note is another slightly ridiculous thing. The steam cannon mounted in the prow, it's propelled by steam. Now, granted, there were weapons that utilized steam propulsion, or that were experimented with, especially that utilized steam to propel the projectile. But gunpowder is just better. There's no real reason, I think, you need to use the steam from the engine to fire the gun. But you know, that's Warhammer silliness. But I do think that the vehicle could be made viable if the armor was stripped down, the rear was actually protected, and it utilized the dreadnought wheels, or the footed wheels. I think the Steam Tank could, in fact, be a decent vehicle, especially for a defensive or breakthrough role, as long as you don't mind the likely logistical costs of that. So that is my 2 cents there on the Steam Tank. I do hope you guys enjoyed the video. Hope you find it informative and perhaps entertaining. If you did, be sure to leave a like, subscribe, and share. If you have any comments, critiques, questions, as usual, don't hesitate to put them down below, and I will do my very best to respond as soon as I can. I do thank you all for watching, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye for now.